this up. First point he raises is that deconstruction is used within the academy for the purpose of destroying the tradition, the great books, the idea of Western culture, Western civilization is deconstructed in the 1960s, seized upon gleefully for its political social agenda and its effectiveness in doing this. And it's predicated, as Derrida says, on being applicable to the entirety of Western thought, as always, because he says that the Western tradition privileges the oral over the written, which is manifestly false. However, to repeat myself, there is a tradition of the humanities that does arise where the oral is privileged over the written, and that is the 18th century project of attributing human language as the subject of human study, and then extending that through the course of time in anthropology, seeing it as a group phenomena sociologically or even internally in psychology, where the mind is the central focus of study. There, the vocal or the oral tradition is more important. It's more important what I feel and what I think than what I say or what I write down. That tradition is subject to Derrida's anti-logocentrism. So I see him as a double-edged sword that destroys the human sciences. Because it does fall prey to the problem that he identifies here. So let's trace the argument out here a little bit. And I'm going to read extracts from Young for the purposes of people that aren't here, but just to refresh your memories as well. Page 32. Pursued to its logical conclusion of illogicality, of nihilistic chaos, deconstruction will only succeed in canceling itself out along with everything else. That's what we've just argued. That's the problem. However, postmodernists have learned to live with cognitive dissonance and apply the solvent of deconstruction only to the ideas of their perceived enemies. It's a useful tool. We'll continue to wield the tool. We will say that your words and your appeals to reason are just Western, or they're patriarchal, or they're racist. We'll continue to use that vocabulary and say that we can't talk about any of these things because of this hermeneutic of suspicion applied to everybody else's assertions that we don't like. But we're going to ignore that the view of language that we have brought forward also has to bite and affect our own view of language. If I'm attacking the patriarchy, then I'm effectively representing the matriarchy, if you will. If I'm attacking a white view of the world, then I'm privileging a black view of the world. Whatever those terms mean, because I think they're both nonsensical terms. But as he says, such is the impeccable logic of deconstructive illogic. The idea of Western civilization is hollow because deconstruction shows that all conceptions are self-contradictory. But since the concept of deconstruction is itself contradictory, it can be happily ignored when its implications prove inconvenient for our own favorite ideals. Although deconstruction has lost some of its prominence and luster in the academic world, it remains, as Stanley Fish intimates, indispensable for the flourishing of postmodernism. Indispensable. So we must not get rid of the tool of deconstruction. We must continue to wield it against our enemies, lest they arise up again, and we have to keep on killing them. So, and as he notes in a concluding statement, there is irony here insofar as deconstruction entails, reveals the emptiness of the postmodern project even while making it possible. So postmodernism is a wholly negative project. It builds nothing. It destroys only. It is anti-logocentric. But with this, I'm arguing it's also anti-humanistic. It attacks the idea that there's a common human nature, and it must do so. because our view of the logos entails what it means to be a human being. But if we have no common humanity, then we have no common language, we have no common reasoning, then the academy is engaging in various language groups talking about themselves in ways that are irrational or incomprehensible to other groups. And so, although the university begins as a pursuit of knowledge, or an articulation of what knowledge means, because God holds all things together in himself, and there's a unity to that knowledge in Christ, in the Logos. Now there is no Logos holding it all together, and things just fall apart. And including the concept of human nature, that falls with it. So the idea of personhood collapses. And we will get in more contemporary literary theories defenses of the environment, so-called eco-criticism, not in the sense that we need to save the whales, not in that sense, but more in the sense that nature is a category that deserves equal treatment to human nature. We've been privileging in the humanities tradition, thinking that human beings are set apart from the rest of the created order. They bear God's image. They deserve special treatment. And that idea, that privileging, is part of the whole logocentric tradition that has now been destroyed. And with it, we have to destroy the concept of human nature, which allows us to treat bugs differently than human beings. Because why is a human being worth any more than a bug? Or an amoeba? Or a virus? Or artificial intelligence? Never mind the animate world, let's talk about the inanimate world. And so in contemporary lit theories, you will get arguments that human consciousness is just as well preserved in cyberspace as it is in an individual, and the individual is dispensable, particularly because the individual produces carbon, and carbon is destroying the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a circle. So when I say it's anti-humanistic, I mean it more radically, that it really is hostile to human nature and seeks to destroy it. That's how negative it is. It's not just irrationalism, it's committed to the annihilation of humanity. That's the logical conclusion of the position. If there is no such thing as human nature, if human nature is seen as not only distinct from the rest of the world but hostile to it, then we must destroy that, just like we destroyed Western civilization, logocentrism, etc. Comments or questions?
I'd be curious about when you talk about anti-logocentrism.
That's how Derrida's project is called. Because he says the whole Western tradition is logocentric. That's it. Yeah.
Yes. Would Derrida make a distinction between the centrality of reason and the centrality of the written word? Because oral tradition can also very much be based on reason. That's what I'm wondering.
He's not even interested. He's not trying to defend. So this is the irony here. And this is the thing that you might not expect. He says that the Western tradition is based on the privileging of the oral over the written. But then when he says that this privileging ought to be flipped on its head. It ought to be the written over the oral. And the written and the things that come out of reason, the written word is subject to the structuralist linguistics of Saussure, and the sign and signifier, and he says that there is no sense of even human nature, or things like reason is a we have no access to concepts like that, or ideas like reason or human nature or God or the individual even.
So his supposition is that the written word is based on the oral word.
No. He says the Western tradition is, but he says that it isn't so. It is always written for and ought to be seen that way. Rather than this, it's a sort of a Copernican turn he's proposing here. And it's not on human words only, it's written words. He says the written word ought to be considered to be more primary than the oral. And then subject to the way in which Saussure parses out linguistics to work, which is signs referring to other signs in a binary fashion. It's very confusing.
So he's posing a theory about language.
First of all,
Yeah.
yes. Or he has a certain view of the Western tradition, which is that we have thus far privileged the oral over the written. That's his first point. That we've always said that this is better. And I just said, really? Is that true? And the answer is no, it's not true at all. It's not remotely true. But it is the French approach to language with Saussure and company in the mid-18th century does think that human language begins in an oral way and then gives way to a written. That is true, but that's an 18th century assertion. It's not true of the whole Western. It's the attempt to understand words from a human perspective only, and then to give a little bit of backstory to it, give it an anthropology. So the earliest people were, let's say, animal-like creatures that lived in caves and grunts and cries, and then as they evolved, etc.
So he's arguing that the basis for language should be the written word.
Yes.
But at the same time, there's a sense of undergirding that the written word is divorced from the centrality of reason.
Well, he says that reason is a concept that we only know through language, and there's no basis for it outside of language. We're in the prison house of language, if you will, and we can't get out of the prison. There's no outside the text. He will say repeatedly, there's no outside the text. All we have is references within the text and how words refer to other words. They get their meaning by differentiation from one another. He calls it différence. Puts an A in there to identify what he means as being different than what we normally mean by difference. Because when we normally mean difference and identity, we're referring to concepts that lie outside of it. And you say, this is not that. That's a difference. But then you're appealing to an idea of truth, as in things are not all identical. There's a difference between this and that. He doesn't want you to appeal out to a concept outside of words. It always is a self-referential, textual thing. It's a strange development, but that nonetheless is his allegation.
Does he wish for oral tradition or oral reasoning to kind of follow from written text, like people develop language based off of written text? Like, is part of his theory of language that people's...
I don't think he has any positive ambitions for it. He simply wants to show that the limitations of human knowledge. And I don't think he necessarily, although I think he probably leans this way, but he doesn't necessarily want it to have a social political agenda to it. He's a sort of a skeptic. Except I needed to say this, and Jung identifies, and I think it's an important point. He must not be seen in the same vein as the long observed, I'm going to erase this now because I'm running out of space, dispute between the realists in the medieval period and the nominalists. So Richard M. Weaver, in Ideas Have Consequences, sees the whole of Western thought since the medieval period as being this debate between the nominalists and the realists. And the realists said that, like Aristotle, the idea is contained in the particular thing, right? So when we say that this is a person, we're not only talking about the individual, but what that individual represents. It's a person. It's a transcendental concept, as it were. Or when we say, and it will be applied in the Eucharist, when it says, "Take, eat, this is my body given for you." In Catholic theology, they'll say, well, there's something of the essence of Christ being asserted in that. It's not just the bread. It's what it represents, and what it represents is the essence of Christ in this. And so that's the realist position, is that it contains the particular thing as well as the concept outside it, whereas the nominalists say that words only refer to the thing. Like this is a bread, and we that's what our words are. So it's just the name, the nomen. The word refers to the thing, but not to a thing signified by it, the transcendental that lies behind it. That's the dispute there. And we could see Derrida as an illustration of he's just asserting a form of nominalism, but he's more radical than that. He's saying we can't even know that. Our words don't refer to anything. They refer to other words, and the words are just signifiers that are so we don't even have a knowledge of what the nominalists held. It's a nominalist view of nominalism, really. That's what it is. So it's far more radical than anything that we've seen up to this point. As I say, I'm not sure, I made that up on the spot, but it's a nominalist view of nominalism, more or less. Yes, we use that word distinctly, but that word only means things in relation to other words. It never points to the thing, the race. And here it's not even the capital R race, it's just the small r race. It doesn't even point to that. It just points to other words. And then the text, the written text, is always an endless array of signifiers pointing to other signifiers. And what they signify is nothing. It's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. Like Macbeth says when Lady Macbeth dies. It's a statement of nihilism. It's a view of language that's written from a nihilist perspective, and it has nihilistic consequences. Now the consequences are very gleefully seized upon by the social political critics that arise post-1960s to attack the Western tradition. It's a wholly negative movement. Derrida, and I always say this about him, seems to be very consistent in his views here. At least he recognizes that you can't just use it this way. It also applies to all language, including that of those who believe they're benefiting from the tool. So I will give him whatever I think of the view. He seems to have an integrity about him, which his critics don't, those that like to use his techniques but don't like how it cuts both ways. They don't want to bring those to attention. So as I say, Derrida is still used whenever you want to attack the patriarchy or whatever, but the view of language is going to attack the matriarchy as well, because it's about language. It's not about how men use language. It's about language itself. That's the problem, right? So go ahead.
No, sorry for trying to...
No. Please.
But I'm curious, why then does Derrida wish to emphasize the written word if even the written word things don't have any meaning except indifference to the other things? Because wouldn't the same problem be found in spoken word? So why is this distinction being made?
Well, it probably would be there in the written word or in the spoken word as well. Yes, because even the grunts and cries are only one cry is only different from another by differentiation. I think that's true. Yeah. So his claim is that we're privileging the voice in the Western tradition, which, as I've said, is only true in the view of language from the 18th century onward. And he says if we just flip it around and say, well, actually, it's the written word, that solves the problem of that, or it points out to the bigger problem of words meaning anything. And I think, well, that also holds true about, as you say, it includes that. And so all you are asserting is that human beings can't say anything meaningful, which, as I say, nominalists would never assert that. They're just saying we can't conclude things from our use of language here. When we say this is my body, it's a metaphorical use of language. It's a symbol. And the question is, what is it? And everyone recognizes that. When Christ says, this is my body broken for you, he gives it to his disciples. When in churches we celebrate the Eucharist, whatever, and the priest says the same thing, do they really think that that the bread is his body? And the answer from a Catholic perspective is yes, we do. And Luther's question is, well, what happens to the bread? Like the bread on the plate, what happens to the bread then, if it is that, and in terms of identity? And so we need to rejig that a bit, and so then that is perceived as a debate between the nominalists and the realists, and they'll talk about the influence of nominalism, Scotus, etc., on Luther, etc. That's a debate for the theologian, and there's a discussion point there about those particular things. But in both positions, whether you're a Lutheran or whether you're a Catholic, they think there's something there. There's something there. It's either bread, or it's the presence of Christ, or it's still the presence of Christ in the bread, but it's not the identity of it, because there's no bread left if it is Christ. This is the body, yeah, but then there's no bread. Luther says, well, where's the body of Christ? And he says it's under the bread. Well, what does that mean? Exactly. He means we need to articulate in a certain way that the bread is preserved, as well as the essence that we mean by this is the body given to you. But it's still considered a sacrament in Lutheran theology. And I would say in Protestant theology in general, it's still considered a sacrament. It's just that it seems irrational, the position that the bread now is the body, or they lift up the plate and it's transubstantiated to that. It was bread, and now the priest lays his hands on it, it's transubstantiated into the body. And said, but that defies our understanding, our reason that. So it's a quibble, but he's not saying that the sacrament isn't a sacrament. Anyway, but as I say, in both cases, there's not a denial of the reality of the world or our ability to describe it, such that bread doesn't mean anything anymore, let alone God. That's not there. But come Derrida and the post-structuralists and the deconstructionists and their contemporary exponents, that is effectively what they're asserting. Our words mean whatever we say they mean, but they mean nothing outside of our assertion. There's no common ground where you can say, you say that's a dog, but it's a cat. You can't call it a dog. And they say, I can call it whatever I want. Because there's no dogness there, and the word dog could have been cat, and now I'm calling a dog a cat. And who are you to say otherwise? Because language never refers to anything. It refers to what we mean by the use of the words. That's the contemporary perspective on it. And so a man can be a woman. The environment can be given personal rights. We can give them human rights. We can attribute human rights to corporations. We can attribute them to computers, all that sort of thing. We can blur those categories, because the categories, which were distinct, are actually just what is meant by the words, and the words can change their meaning because there's nothing that undergirds them in any way. Yes?
I would suppose that this whole view of Ciceronian structuralism is founded on a view of, in some sense, that we only have access to concepts and not to the race, as Augustine would assert.
The signa, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I would suppose then that if you take away the Christian tradition, or you let's say you assert the tradition is true, what Augustine says is true.
Yep.
And so you apprehend in the particular a representation of the universal form.
Yep.
And so you're able to properly define the essence of the thing and make a distinction between a sign and a thing, and a sign actually designates a thing outside of the mind. And in that respect, deconstructionism would be impotent, in a sense. It wouldn't be able to touch that. But if you assume Christianity is false, or if you reject the Augustinian view of language, then what you're left with, I would suppose, would be the organicist view of human nature, which the Enlightenment postulates. And only if you accept that, which is the premise of materialism and of atheism,
yes,
then deconstruction.
Then it's whole, and that's my position. That's exactly my position. Yeah. If you presuppose all the things you assert you presuppose, then your position has refuted itself,
Mm-hmm.
and you have no business continuing to draw a paycheck in the academy, because it's just that this is not knowledge at all, and you think that knowledge is impossible, and you assert that, and you plainly believe it, but you're not willing to be consistent in your beliefs and say that, well, therefore I shouldn't be paid to do this, unless you think that you're serving some sort of political social function in destroying anybody's pretensions to knowledge, which Derrida seems to think, actually. He thinks that there's a benefit to this in some ways. It gets rid of it's basically the skeptical position all along. Like, why are we claiming that we're superior in any sense? Let's take the cynical position, in fact. We're just like the dogs on the ground. That's what kunos means. It's the dog. The cynics slept outside on the ground. They didn't construct anything because they saw that the claims that human beings make about human nature were assertions based on premises that could not be demonstrated. So they're very consistent. It's a very cynical view of the world. It looks at human beings from the dog's perspective. Not from the view from nowhere, but from the perspective of the dogs. We're just animals. That's the Darwinist assertion. Darwinism arises out of this whole project. I said this repeatedly. It's just a biological theory that appends itself to a certain view of humanity that is presented in the language initiative of the early 18th century. The theory is there before the science, which is why I say it's not a scientific theory at all. It's a sort of myth that we like to give. And what is the myth? We began in caves and gradually became more and more civilized and more rational, and we made progress, and we're superior to those of the past. That's the myth of modernity. And if we pursue what is essential to human nature, namely our shared feelings, we will get rid of all the problems of society, which are mostly rooted in religion, allegedly. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you can, right? John Lennon. You get the crowd saying, oh, yeah, we just need to get beyond religion. That's the real problem here. So let me move on to the response.